Alistair MacDonald. I'm a retired head teacher,
Yes.
but currently working on the Pupil Deprivation Grant, as it's called, in Wales. I was looking at page 11 in the document today, and the graph shows that the gap in 2011-12 was 27.2%, and in 2013 was 27.4%. My understanding is that that's an average, and there are lots and lots and lots of schools that have done a fantastic job in narrowing the gap. They must be matched by a similar number of schools where the gap has widened. Now, I'm essentially optimistic, and I think that schools can do a fantastic job and can learn from each other. But do we, to some extent, collude here by trying to pretend that schools, this is a problem that can be totally solved in our schools? 27% is a huge gap. Should we actually be saying something? It's not just about schools.
I mean, the Secretary of State referred to the issue about employers, I recently visited a very prestigious public school where the work experience was the exclusive. There were companies which were exclusively offering work experience opportunities to the pupils from that school. Now, we need to be able to broaden this and make sure that our leading businesses will enable people to achieve things. And similarly, what we can't do is have the schools in the challenging areas squeezed so much that they don't have those opportunities for all of their pupils. So I think we have to look at the systemic things here and make sure that we really are putting our efforts into the most challenging areas. Is really what I was getting at with the example of the coastal schools and so on. We've got to go to those really difficult areas and say, why aren't we making progress here? And not, what's wrong with the leadership of that school or so on. If there's something wrong with the leadership of the school, that's a different conversation. But it's the issue is what are the things deeply embedded in our system that are not enabling us to address those things? And if we don't do that, then we're not going to make the progress we need to do on this massively important policy.
I'm sure that's correct, but I think a couple of things that struck me about Sharon and Claire's introduction was that you were not accepting any excuses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I thought that was you predicted every child can succeed, and that seems to me. And obviously, there's a very wide range around the 27%. But I think we got two teachers here who said actually there are no excuses, and even children in these very deprived areas can succeed with the sorts of initiatives which you were both talking about.
Heath Monk from the Future Leaders Trust.
Right.
Really inspiring to hear from Sharon and from Claire. And one of the things that struck me, as you were just saying, is about the ethos of schools and creating a culture where there are high expectations and no excuses. And I'm wondering if we spend too much time talking about strategies and not enough time talking about how you explicitly and intentionally go about creating that culture. Because it seems to me that what they've done is more about them and their belief and the way they've instilled that in the whole school community than the actual strategies that they've put in place.
There is, the thing about no excuses is absolutely right. Just going back to the issue about, are we ignoring what's happening, on a social level and trying to make up for it in schools? Yes, possibly, but we have to, don't we? We have to. We have a moral imperative. But we said very early on in my school, it's mainly about reading, isn't it, at primary school? That's where you're going to get your key outcomes. So, we identify the children whose parents do not listen to them read ever, for one reason or another, and we just make it happen in school. It has to happen in school. And there is, it has to happen every single day. And we track that through until we're confident that it does. So we do end up just making it happen, but you're right, it's the drive of the leadership team, actually, in order to make that happen.
Yeah, we set up in 2009, and we decided we wanted a school motto, so we didn't come out with a fancy Latin one. Our motto, which I guess is no surprise, our motto is work hard, be nice, no excuses. Now, that is important to staff as well as children. It's slapped up all over the school, and I regularly refer to it and make children and adults look at it to remind them that the no excuses line is the most relevant one. I've worked for many different local authorities over the years, and in some there are high expectations, and in some there aren't high expectations. I've worked with groups of heads who've been driven to talk about how they can improve standards and how they can share their best practice. I've also sat with groups of head teachers who've sat around like something from Macbeth, telling each other why the children can't do it. Now, of course, local authorities drive the culture within a local authority. And some drive a positive culture and some don't. So I would suggest that we also look at the local authorities and indeed academy sponsors. Some have a wonderful impact and some don't. Some take on more challenging schools than others. But we can't disagree with the fact that sponsors and local authorities do either create a better culture or condone a poor culture of either high or low expectations.
Paul Crisp from the Centre for the Use of Research and Evidence in Education. Russell made a very interesting point earlier on about the drivers on school leaders to adopt the high profile, the instant solutions as opposed to the longer term, less exotic, probably more effective ones. And the Secretary of State said earlier that she wasn't minded to introduce sanctions around what people spend the pupil premium on. So my question really is, what levers might the profession, collectively and individually, exercise to encourage school leaders to be selective and choose the interventions that are likely to work? Particularly, I think, in those circumstances where, for instance, under an Ofsted judgment, they're sometimes inclined to throw the kitchen sink of solutions at the problem rather than maybe selecting the 1, 2 or 3 that are likely to be effective. Can the profession do something about it itself?
I think there's a sense in which those two most recent questions are in fact connected, because culture is made up of lots of less exotic day-to-day specific actions rather than, say, long-term initiatives. And I think one of the challenges that we face is as the pressure rises, we're driven into fairly short-term solutions on this. So culture change and doing the right thing is a long, drawn-out and sometimes painful process as well. And without wanting to see a reduction in accountability, sometimes what we are is asking for the results very early in terms of turning a school round and giving the right amount of space to a school leader to make the difficult choices, because cultural change can also involve challenging people's expectations, and that's not pleasant for a while, and you can get dissent while you're doing it. 3 years later, the results begin to pay off. 1 or 2 years into this, it can often be the worst point in time. So, for example, I would like to see when someone takes over a school, Ofsted turning up straight away and then not turning up for 3 years or so on that basis. It's great if you get a inspection very quickly because it gives you a mandate for change and you can blame it on someone else. But if they turn up 12 months in, it could be getting worse before it's getting better. So I don't know if that's something the profession can do. We can certainly lobby and campaign for it, but also we can talk about what works, and that's what we're doing today. And hearing great heads talk about what actually does work is another thing that does pass the message on.
Yeah. Caroline Boswell from the Greater London Authority.
Yeah.
Really inspiring to hear about the leadership and the teaching in school and the focus on no excuses. I'm just interested in this point about collaboration, both between schools, but also with businesses, with scientific, cultural and sporting institutions. And for me, I'm sure for most of us, it's not either or, but it's about how we make that collaboration, because it shouldn't be acceptable for our big employers to recruit from the most exclusive schools, frankly. And I think we should be developing the sort of partnerships that are taking that vision and ambition that we're seeing in our best schools more widely, and how we can all support that.
How do we get schools to share more?
I'm actually enormously optimistic at the moment, because I am seeing quite a a massive culture change within the profession, and the debate we've had around our blueprint for a self-improving system has really highlighted that over the last year or so, where we've seen, the profession saying, actually, we can't carry on just waiting for things to be done to us. We've got to actually step up and take control of these things ourselves, and that relates to the previous point that Russell was talking about. Now, part of that is that there is an enormous appetite out there for collaboration. Look at the number of multi-academy trusts that are springing up all over the country. Look at the teaching school alliances and some of the work that they're doing there. Look at the 21, I think it's now 25,000 volunteers from places of work who are going into schools through the Inspiring the Future programme and the Primary Futures programme then as well, all those, the Inspiring Women programme, all those sorts of things where people in business are saying, yeah, we do actually want to go into school. I know I gave a negative example there, but there's a lot of really positive stuff, and I'm seeing an enormous amount of really goodwill from employers who are saying, we've got to stop standing at the sidelines and moaning. We want to get up and come into schools, and they're doing that. So you've got that. You've got work going on between schools. And the great thing about that is that we know, again, from the research, that within school variation is such a big issue. And when you've got schools working collaboratively, then they can help each other because they can say, okay, well, our Department X is not performing that well yet, but we know that in one of the other schools in our little group it is, so we can go and work with them. And it's that sort of thing. But you've got to have a culture where people can firstly take risks and secondly make mistakes and learn from them. And that's been the big problem, I think, with the accountability system that we've had. Be interesting to see what Sir Michael has to say later, because I think there's a positive culture shift beginning in Ofsted, and that's got to happen, because otherwise people can't. We won't be able to do that. You can say it's important. We all know it's important. But if people think their job's on the line, they're not going to do it. So we've got to have that culture of collaboration.
Russell, is there anything from your perspective on how the money is spent which could support what's just been said?
I think there's an opportunity in terms of how we allocate funding towards collaboration. I think my point would probably track a little bit in terms of how we've presented the differences between freedom and collaboration through the academy movement. And in many ways, I think the presentation of it has got it entirely the wrong way round, that the emphasis on academisation was about freedom and autonomy rather than the benefits of a collaboration within a trust. And actually, where we see things succeeding, it's often through that capital that they've created. And in many ways, we thrust autonomy on schools and hope that they would collaborate. We should have probably thrust collaboration on them, and then they would have demanded the autonomy because they'd have had the capacity to cope with it. Lots of small primaries are not easily going to cope with the freedom unless they're joined together in groups. So we've made our arguments the wrong way round, but I think we're unpicking that and we're starting to come at it from you should group together first, and then you should demand ever greater freedoms as a result of it. I would like to see some structures to permit that are not about the sort of coffee morning collaboration where you can get together like Macbeth and moan about the world on that, but actually you have strong mutual accountability for each other. But maybe you haven't made that leap full into the multi-academy trust yet. I think you'd see a huge uptake in collaboration if we managed to do that.
My name's Lynn Churchman. I'm Director of Maths and Numeracy with National Numeracy. We're a charity trying to improve maths and numeracy across the school system and adults. Our three missions are to do with changing public attitudes to maths and numeracy, helping to raise achievement in schools and helping to raise achievement with adults. My question is around the culture thing, and I'm interested, Sharon, in whether you have the every teacher a teacher of numeracy equivalent, because it's harder, and it's all to do with the culture thing, and it's to do with teacher beliefs that you have to have a maths brain to succeed, and all the evidence says that's not true. There is no such thing as a maths gene that you inherit if you're in Portsmouth, or you don't if you're in Portsmouth. So there's a set of things around ethos and culture in schools that can play really strongly into raising achievement in maths and numeracy, and having numeracy across the curriculum functioning, that we're not tapping into sufficiently well in a lot of schools, because a lot of disadvantaged pupils, they don't get the 5 or more A stars to C's because they don't get the maths. They do get 5 or more A stars to C's, but it doesn't include maths very often.
I can't resist just adding a tweak to that one, and that's the distinction between numeracy and maths. which is, one's measured and the other isn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure it really exists in the primary sector to such an extent as in the secondary sector. I think because all the teachers are teaching everything, aren't they? So there is a belief that the child can achieve across the board. Just some very practical things that we've done in my schools is introduce parent workshops and in a very sort of non-threatening way, starting when the child enters in year R and following that group of parents through. We're just about getting up to year 3 now. So, they've continued at the lower end. Just really practical ideas, how to support your child at home, maths and the environment, setting the table, counting into, really basic things from early years upwards. So we intend to carry that right through till that first cohort gets up to year 6. And then we'll be speaking to our secondary school about what they can do when they then move into year 7. Thank you.
Is there anything on maths or numeracy you'd like to add?
Yes, I'd like to kind of go back a step, really, because we're a very data-rich school and we're completely data-driven, well, not completely, but very data-driven. And when I asked an English teacher to give me her target group of students, which needed to be 80%, she only gave me 60%. I said, look, you're 20% short, I need another 20%. And she gave me another 2 names. And I was a bit puzzled at first. And I said, why have you only given me 2? She said, well, they're 10% each, aren't they? Now, we actually do have more than 10 children in each year group. And I had to go right back to making sure that the teachers remembered the maths that they'd done as students themselves. Because in secondary schools, in many cases, they stop. Obviously, they've all got GCSE maths, and they've taken whatever maths tests they need to take when they've left university. But we really had to go back to making sure the teachers understood the maths purely for the data, and that's been our starting point. We haven't done too much work on every teacher being a teacher of numeracy or a teacher of maths. That is something that we need to think about. At the moment, I'm trying to get them to understand maths sufficiently to be able to deal with the data. And that's not because I've got a poor teaching staff. I've got a great staff. They're wonderful people. It's just a gap that I had not anticipated and therefore needed to deal with.
Hi, I'm Jad Ali, teacher. I just wanted to link to that. We have so many labels in secondary schools. My role is a director of inclusion, so I'm constantly saying, do you know your PP from your PP Plus? Do you know your LAC from your CLA? Do you know your young carers from your EAL? All of those things are so important, but actually do our students themselves know what label is attached to them? And something that I'm working on right now with both my staff and my students are, if you have a statemented student or someone with a healthcare plan, they have an annual review. If there's a looked after child, they have a personal education plan. But how many of our disadvantaged students actually know that they are eligible, not entitled, but eligible for further support? And how many of our inset days are delivered in staff getting to know these students rather than those leads, rather than those assistant head teachers? Are our teachers actually aware of these issues, and are they actually aware of what to do? And I notice there's lots of companies, lots of senior leaders here. Is it fair that lots of teachers might have an excessive amount of students that are in their classroom that need that extra support but have the same amount of PPA time? And I know that there's ways of using the funding to help that, but I just wanted to strip it back down to actually the front line. Do the teachers know who these students are, what their difficulties are? I know you mentioned we know all of the barriers, but do every single teacher know the differences between the disadvantaged statuses? That's all I wanted to say.
For you, Brian, I'm afraid.
Gosh, it's a really difficult one, actually, because my immediate reaction there, whilst I'm not disagreeing with a lot of what you said there, was I balked at that word labels. I was worried about the idea of labelling a child, you're a pupil premium child. And I suppose that comes partly back to the fact the way the money is allocated, actually, because, it is a proxy indicator. And what we need to be looking is at all of the children in the school. There might be some children who might not be one of the ones who attracts the money, but who is definitely from a disadvantaged background and who we need to help. So I have a bit of a worry about that. But I think the wider point that you're making is that it is is a really important question about professional learning for teachers and the support we give them and the leadership that we give them. How do we enable all of our teachers to know all of the needs of all of the pupils who they teach? And I think that's a crucially important thing. It comes back to workload, actually, you know, that there is often too little time to do that. You know, I was head of a school which had a very, very wide range of ability and all sorts of children. We had to do lots of training in some of the very specific special needs that some of the children had there. And I think it's an enormous challenge, but I think you've given us a challenge there that we really need to think about. What are the best methods for doing that? How can we do that without labelling those children as, okay, you know, I've got the badge, I'm a Pupil Premium child, you know, which I think could be damaging. What we want to say is, I'm somebody who has as much right as anyone else in the school to achieve the highest standards, and I have a right to every bit of support from the school to get that. That's the sort of ethos that we want to see in the school. So that it comes back to the no excuses again, doesn't it?
Hello, I'm Frankie Sulker. I'm the Director for Children and Young People in the London Borough of Lewisham, so one of those local authorities, Sharon. Thank you for the fantastic presentations that you all gave, but also particularly inspirational from Sharon and Claire. And I wanted to try to build on a couple of the questions that went before, because I was kind of hoping that the extra mile would be gone, but I'm going to push it now. We've heard the Secretary of State say today that she's happy to consider this report, this very, very helpful report from the Education Foundation and Sutton Trust around incentives, but isn't interested in sanctions. Actually, incentives can be positive and negative, as we all know, and she does that just as much as all the rest of us do in our own fields. I actually agree with her that it's not something for national government to do, but I actually think there's a huge amount of potential for local groups of schools through Multi-Academy Trust, those local authorities that are still interested, Sharon, and others, to try to look at what local incentives. There's a huge amount of flexibility of how we actually use pupil premium funding. So I wanted to ask whether you thought that there was any particular incentives that might work in your own, particularly to the heads, to your own local milieu. I'm certainly thinking of implementing some around our patch that would really focus the money and the attention on what works. And while I've got the mic, I just wanted to say the bigger gaps, of course, come from our looked after children. It was good to hear our colleague in the front talk about that. And I'm well known as being the mother from hell on my patch, where the gaps are actually scandalous, really scandalous for our looked after children. And I just wondered whether any of the panel had anything to say about my kids.
First of all, local incentives, among groups of schools, I think could be a great idea, really. In Aldershot, there are 10 primary schools, surprisingly quite a lot, actually, for a relatively small town. And over the last sort of 10, 20 years, virtually every one of those schools has been in a category at some time, schools dipping in and out, bubbling under. Nobody knew when the next one would go. You know, it's all to do with stability and leadership. And about 3 years ago, we got together as a group of heads with a couple of newly appointed heads included in the group and just said, right, we've got to stop this. So we kind of took control, really, and we set up, we've got a really strong leadership network now between the heads, very open and quite challenging as well. But then we also set up for every year group, these year group clusters that meet every term in a different, so one school would host that year group for the whole year. We started off just by asking teachers to come along with their books, a couple of books, English and maths books. They were open on the tables, and just that, you know, that openness and somebody else looking at how you're marking a piece of work or what the standard is in that year group in the school down the road is quite an eye-opener. Once we'd sort of got all of that out of the way and raised the bar regarding standards, we then set up sort of action research projects for each of the year groups, and that's how we've run it in the last 2 years, which have focused on, and one could quite easily focus on Pupil Premium, in fact they have this year, culminating in a final presentation to which we invited the local authority inspectors along, and everybody involved, real culture of celebration. I'm delighted to tell you that all 10 schools are now good or better, and that the outcomes last year in terms of SATs, attainment at year 2 and year 6, the outcomes for children in Aldershot, which is a socially deprived area, were better than Hampshire as a whole. So there's evidence of success there. Thank you.
Incentives.
It's really interesting. We got this Pupil Premium prize recently, and it was a big prize, and we decided that we had a moral responsibility to spend some of that money rolling out our practice to other schools. So we set a bit aside, and we decided that one of the best ways to make it possible for other schools to learn about what we were doing was to open our doors and give staff a bit of time to show people around. So we're doing that. Unfortunately, the schools that come to see us are the schools that are already doing really quite well and want to do better, and that's been very clear and not particularly unexpected. But I think in terms of it, the possibility of being able to use that as some kind of model, I do think that if successful schools were given a bit of funding that meant that they could release staff to A, facilitate visits, and B, perhaps go out and visit other schools where there is a problem and therefore advise them, then that could be money very well spent locally. It's like the old Beacon School model, really, which I thought was a very successful one. But if it was particularly focused on Pupil Premium, then I think the schools hosting that and providing that would be quite proud to do so, and that it would be very accessible for other schools. We have visitors from many different academy chains, lots of different local authorities. It's not something that's exclusive to the ARC chain.
Hi, Mike Treadaway, FFT and Education Data Lab. It's sort of back to funding in a way. It's clear from what Claire and Sharon said that implementing no excuses takes time and resources, and the higher the level of disadvantage, the more time and resources it's going to take. Russell mentioned issues of possible double funded disadvantage. I'd like to query that. It's clear if we look at national data that for students who've been FSM all their time through school, the gap is about twice as big as it is for those who've been FSM just once, and yet they all get the same funding. Shouldn't there be some level of variation of Pupil Premium funding dependent on the level of disadvantage of the Pupil Premium students?
I think my reference to double funding was that there's a deprivation element in the base funding formula as well as in the specifically targeted at children, and therefore you get some interesting variations between, for example, schools serving a locally deprived community within an otherwise affluent local authority or vice versa that can result in some very fair allocations. I think it is correct that it is an area that we should debate as to whether the Pupil Premium funding should vary according to certain characteristics, whether it be degree of poverty, whether there are additional characteristics that you might wish to add on. The fact that we have both a sort of threshold for allocation and a flat sum of money makes it a slightly blunt tool in that way. It makes it a very simple tool to administer, and weighing up the cost of the variation versus the benefit, I think, would be the challenge.
Robert Wilne, former head teacher from a school in Newham. My day job is Director of Secondary for the National Centre of Excellence in Teaching Mathematics, but today I'm wearing the hat, or more accurately bow tie, as a trustee of the Sovereignty Foundation. I've been a school governor for pretty much most of the last 7 years, and I'm struck by the fact, I hope I'm not wrong, that there's no representative here today from a school governance organisation like the National Governors Association or ESCOS. And I really wonder what the panel think the role of school governors is in this, and how can school governance by and large be improved to support the work that school leaders are doing to ensure the best outcomes for the pupils?
I think the first thing there is that governors need to be enabled to be aware of these issues and to understand what the schools are doing. And I think it's incumbent upon the schools obviously to report to the governors and to give them insights into the sorts of things they're doing, and to enable the governors to feed into that, and the role of governors then to ask the right questions, supportive questions, challenging questions, to try and do that. I think we're in quite a positive place in the sense that of the restructuring of governing bodies to enable them to be not only representative but also have the right skill set. There is a particular skill set, and we need people who can come in and ask the right questions. A lot of what we've talked about this morning is about data. and there's a danger that that data becomes quite esoteric and it's not it's not made accessible. But there are also, there will be people who are on governing bodies who are from the community and they understand some of the challenges there, and they've got simple answers. Quite often, a lot of the things we've heard about this morning are quite simple answers that they can feed in. So they're part of the team. They should be working as a key part of the school, and I'm sure in the best schools that will always be the case.
I've worked in areas for most of my career where I've had a governing body who opens the envelope when they arrive at the meeting and have lacked a great deal of skill. However, now I have the kind of governing body that's being promoted. And I was quite happy with the previous arrangements because they did as they were told. But now that I have a governing body that does ask questions, that is made up of people from a wide range of professions, I'm absolutely delighted because they've helped me to be a better head teacher. They've helped me to think on a different level. They've helped me to overcome some of the problems that I've had to deal with. So actually, yeah, I'm really pleased after over 20 years of headship to have this governing body who really give me a run for my money.
Claire, anything you...
Yeah, you kind of have to train them though, don't you?
Yes.
So, you can... There is the official training, and my governors have had that. We brought in the annual full governor training from the local authority about 3 years ago. To launch the Pupil Premium initiative, really. But then, yeah, it's about you as a head really training them as well, and sort of giving them the right lead-ins and giving them all the right data, of course, so they know what it is that they're meant to be evaluating and asking the questions about. And sometimes we bring along real children's work to meetings, and sometimes even real children, so they can actually see them, and that helps.
Hi, Chloe Sorovich from Teach First. It's a pleasure to have two current and also previous really clearly strong head teachers on the panel today. And I'm just interested, so I was Vice Chair of Governors at a primary school in Tottenham, in one of the most deprived wards of London, in fact, the country, for 5 years. And the last thing I did in that role was work with the rest of the governing body to try and appoint a new head teacher. To me, it was a really exciting school. It was on the way up. It had high levels of deprivation, but had lots going for it, a really vibrant community and a supportive governing body. The first time we went out to recruit, we couldn't even get any applications that we would even consider interviewing. And the second time we went out to recruit, we had two, despite working with networks to kind of get the message out about the role. And it really frightened me, actually, that despite it being such a great opportunity, we couldn't get the talent and the interest in the school, neither outside or even within it. No one was interested in kind of stepping up to the role from the senior team. And it just struck me that, we talk about deprivation and leadership and the importance of it, but actually there's this massive gap. And I just wondered what the panel think about succession planning and what we do about getting more of the people like we've got on the panel today in the
Brian,
system.
can we start with you?
Look, this is an enormous problem. And, we don't like bandying about words like crisis, but there is a recruitment crisis in teaching and in school leadership at the moment, and we've got to be honest about it, and we've got to look at the reasons why they're there and the pressures that are putting people off becoming a head teacher. And as someone who was a head for 16 years and loved every minute of it, I really, I find that very saddening that people don't want to go to it. So in terms of succession planning, I think one of the keys to it is the sort of collaboration I was talking about a few minutes ago, because if you've got groups of schools working together, whether that's in a hard federation or a teaching school alliance or whatever structure, I'm not particularly bothered about the nature of that structure, then you have opportunities to give people experiences beyond their own school and allow them to try out those sorts of things. But we've also got to have a proper structure of professional learning that goes through the career. We call it a professional learning ladder in our school, so that you are helping people along, and we're working. I saw James Toop here somewhere. I'm doing some work with teaching leaders at the moment, speaking at the event on Saturday. Where we're looking at developing middle leaders, and then we need to develop them into senior leaders. We've got systems like future leaders and so on. We develop those people, and we see that as a route through the career, and it needs to be something that we're really talking up. And the Secretary of State alluded to us helping with this, because there is a thing about the messages that come out about the profession and what a great thing school leadership is. And I think it's incumbent upon people like me and Russell to be saying, yeah, go and do it, step up to that, and we need people like you to do that. But at the same time, you've got to have the support when you get into there, so that people are given support and they're not left then to flounder in a challenging school, find themselves being kicked out after a couple of years because they haven't managed to hit one of the indicators. You've got to give them a proper support programme.
I think one of the southern counties reported recently the average number of applicants for a head teacher vacancy is 0.7 at the moment, which creates some challenges on that front. Yes, it depends how they're clustered together, I suppose, on that one. And very often they're finding it's the outstanding schools and the schools they would perceive to be good that aren't getting the applicants, because people perceive the only way to be down on that front. I think there are two barriers. One is the level of risk associated with the role. I don't think it's about reward and pay, although to an extent you can pay for risk, but then you end up paying a great deal of money to get this. When people are thinking, well, a fluctuation in a cohort, the wrong inspection team, a change in the league table method of calculations, and I'm out of a job and my family is suffering as a result of that. Now, there's a lot of moral purpose, but it's hard to get people to take that level of risk. But then I think the other thing that we have to do is to persuade people that they're not losing touch with the children by taking on more senior leadership positions, because the perception is you're swapping the stuff that you love, which is helping children, for spreadsheets and data and administrative routines. And I think that is something we as a profession can do, and to show that actually you're not losing that contact. You're broadening it. It may be slightly shallower, but it's broader, and you are still intimately involved in the lives and hopes of the children within your school. And I think there's a lot that serving heads and the professional associations can do just to get that message across. You're not losing touch with what matters to you.
Thank you, Russell. Sadly, we are out of time. I'd like to thank enormously our four panellists, and slightly sad that the advances in genetic engineering don't allow us to clone Sharon and Claire. But it would be terrific if they were. But thank you, panellists, for a terrific contribution.